This is the Creative Life Show, celebrating being highly creative in a less creative world. I'm Joanna Peters, coach and mentor to professional creatives and creative professionals. And I talk to other creatives, innovators and thinkers about how we create, face down our critics, stay on track, get noticed and paid, and do the work we want to do. And I'm sharing the progress of my own book, all about creative people and how we thrive. Hello and welcome. It's the week of the 3rd of September and back to school, but I love this time of year. It makes me feel really alive, the way the air is changing on our skin and the gardens and the whole energy of what's going on. And I've been thinking a lot about the way we sense things and perceive things. A lot of us who are creative have these sensitively wired nervous systems, which partly allows us to do what we do. But one of my summer highlights has been that I went to play my violin for 3 days in a huge orchestra, creating a work called Guru Leader. Now, it dates from 1913 by Arnold Schoenberg, and it's huge and lush and romantic. And there were 250 of us playing and singing, which is extraordinary. This huge privilege to get to do that, particularly as an amateur violinist. But I found there were times I really needed to get away from the intensity of it and really the sensory overwhelm of it, of the people and the noise and the music and the concentration, no matter how much I was enjoying it. And one of my intentions for the autumn is to notice a bit more my own sensory state, because I know that when I pay attention to it and stop myself getting overwhelmed, I'm a lot more creative and a lot calmer and happier. I've written a bit more about it on the blog at joannapeters.com, so come and have a read, particularly if you're not a regular blog visitor. Come and leave a comment. Today's interview was such fun to record. I'd like to introduce you to the driving force behind YesYesMarsha, Marsha Shandur. Hello and welcome. Now, I hope you're all sitting comfortably, because today we're talking about telling stories. Now, we always do this on the Creative Life Show, but my guest today has made stories her life. She's Marsha Shandur of YesYesMarsha. Marsha is a storytelling coach and works with all sorts of people who want to connect with other people, which is most of us. Now, if I lived in Toronto, where Marsha lives, I would be going along every month to her True Stories Told Live, which is a monthly storytelling evening. She's also written a book going behind the scenes of the lives of stand-up comedians, and she spent 15 years as a radio DJ in the UK, doing live shows, introducing gigs, and doing lots of interviews. She's also a regular speaker and facilitator at some of the big US creative conferences, including Jeff Goins' Tribes Conference and the Good Life Project. Marsha, welcome to the show. Can you still hear a good story and get the buzz of excitement for it? Are you too busy pulling it to pieces?
Oh my God, not at all. On the contrary, I cannot believe that I have somehow made it my job to just sit and listen to stories all the time. It's so amazing and so fun. And what I love about it is just how different it is. I get to hear so many different things. And actually what happens when you're listening to a well-told story is that your brain thinks that the story is happening to you. So I get to have so many amazing experiences. It's wild. I love it. I will never get sick of it.
So you get to live all these stories that you get to hear that you've helped shape.
Yeah, totally. A lot of things that I don't want to have to experience, but I now have had some experience of running face first into a black bear, of going to prison wrongfully for a weekend, of so many going and protesting at Standing Rock in North Dakota, so many amazing things that I either physically don't have the time or space to do, or some of them that I don't want to do. I don't ever want to have to go to prison wrongfully for a weekend, but I now know what that's like. And my brain has had some experience of that happening to me. It's so cool.
That's fantastic. And a lot of those amazing stories come out at your Toronto show, don't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of where it all started, actually. When I started, I had no idea when I started that show that I would ever do this for my job. But at the very first show, which, side note, had in an audience of 3 people, one of whom was my mum. But at that first show, I had some people tell stories who'd never been on stage in their entire life before. And so I went and sat down with them. And actually on the way to the first meeting, I thought, who the F am I to teach these people how to tell stories? And then I got there and I was like, oh, it's just radio. It's just like radio links, but except you have 10 minutes instead of 20 seconds.
Wow. So that was really the beginning of the angle of storytelling and what you were doing.
Yeah, totally. But I still did it for free. So I would coach all the storytellers because the very first show I didn't coach all of them and one of them wasn't very good. So I was like, okay, blanket rule. I'm now going to sit down with everyone. And after a year, I thought, oh, maybe I should make this my job. But I didn't. I thought that it was limited to me coaching people to tell a 10-minute story on stage at a storytelling show. I couldn't really see what the breadth was beyond that. And I was running a business at the time doing coaching, but teaching networking and making friends in the industry and making friends with your heroes. And then I started to think that maybe I could bring storytelling into it. But at the time I was like, oh, there's lots of different things I want to do. And I actually worked with Jonathan Fields of Good Life Project. And in our first conversation, I said, I've been teaching networking, but now there's this long laundry list of things I do. I teach people how to tell stories. I teach them how to answer the question, what do you do? I teach them how to do this, that, the other. And he said, I listen to you speak and all I hear is storytelling. And I said, no, Jonathan, what you need to understand is that there's actually a long list, which is kind of my vibe with Jonathan Fields all the time. He kind of will tell me the wisest thing anyone's ever said. And I'll be like, shut up, you're not my real dad. And then finally realize that he's right. But so eventually I kind of parlayed the networking stuff into storytelling. And now that's what I teach.
And when did that happen?
So I've sort of started transitioning. I started the business 5.5 years ago, and I started the transition kind of about a year and a half, 2 years in. And then maybe the last 2 years, I've been doing solid storytelling. I sort of had the odd networking client from time to time, but every time I had one, I pushed my prices up so high on that because I sort of got bored of doing it, because unlike storytelling, it was the same every single time almost. And, but, I would, whenever there's a job that I can do, but I don't want to, I make the price high enough that I always ask myself, would you do this for $1 million? And if the answer is yes, then I kind of come back from $1 million and say, well, would you do it for $500,000? Would you do it for 100,000? Would you do it for 10,000? And, but every time I did networking coaching, I'd think, man, if you just read my blog from cover to cover, then you could save yourself $1,000 because I'm pretty much regurgitating what I say on my blog and tailoring it slightly for you. And it just was kind of boring to me to keep saying the same thing every single time. Whereas, as I said, with storytelling, it's always different. And that part of what I'm doing is drawing the story out and getting to listen to the story. But then the other part of what I'm doing is what I call story Tetris, which is like figuring out what stays and what goes and then what order it goes in. And I don't write the story for people, but I give them the structure. And that's the thing where I don't really know how my brain does it. And so it's kind of fun to do. Like I can just see the puzzle of it as they're talking. I can see like, oh, that's the beginning. And then we jump to this bit. And then that's how we link all these 3 ideas up.
And are they coming in with those 3 ideas, or are you going, no, this is the filter you need to get, those are the 3 ideas you want?
So it's mostly me I do what I call story excavation, where I ask them a ton of questions and I kind of get them to describe the story to me, and I take loads and loads of notes. And then within those notes, and often I'll see, like, as we start going into different kind of scenes from the story, I'll be like, ooh, I think that this is the one. So I'll get the details that I need and then draw, it's a matter of drawing those out of them and then asking other questions to see, well, what scene would link with this? And then kind of trying to figure out like how to bring those ideas together. And sometimes that's me asking them a question like, when this happened, did you feel this way? And sometimes they say no. And sometimes they say, oh my gosh, I never thought of it that way, but you're absolutely right. The reason that I did this thing all through my 20s was because of that one thing that happened to me when I was 16. And that makes me feel good because I love being in therapy, even though I would never be a good therapist myself, but sometimes it's fun to play at that.
I love that. Before we get any further, I want a story from you. And as you know, I always ask my guests to tell me about a time of particular creative challenge or difficulty. So let's hear your story.
Okay, so I moved from London to Toronto without a job because to me that seemed really sensible because I was like, oh, it's like a clean break, change continent, change career. And I didn't think change continent, maybe don't have a massive identity crisis at the same time, which has happened because I'd been a radio DJ for 15 years and the previous 7 I'd been at a station in London called XFM, which is now Radio X. And I loved working there so much, but I had this sense after 7 years, for years I thought I wanted to be a radio DJ my whole life. But then towards the end of working at XFM, even though I loved my job there, I started to feel like it wasn't the thing that I was best at. And I moved to Toronto and I really had no idea. And as is often the case when we do this, there's kind of the dark night of the soul where you're like, I'm never going to do anything. And then there's the point where like every idea is the idea. And I was like, I'm going to work for the national broadcaster doing speech radio. No, I'm going to work for a nonprofit doing communications. No. And then I I sort of landed in this course, Marie Forleo's B School, which for anyone that doesn't know is like an online marketing course / cult. And I say that as like a fully paid up member of the cult. I love it.
Yes.
It changed my life. But I did it. It's often people who already have a business, but I did it not knowing what I wanted to do. And I just had no clue. Like I knew I was good at stuff, but I just wanted someone to climb inside my brain and have a look around and then be like, here's a job for you. And so with B School, I was like, oh, I could climb inside my own brain, but I still hadn't figured out what it was. I just was like, I know I'm good at things, but I don't know who would pay me money and what they would pay me money for. And then eventually I had a conversation with someone and they said, well, what do you feel like you're really good at? And I said, well, I'm really good at making volunteers feel like they're super lucky to be working for free. And that was kind of what led me briefly into like a nonprofit thing, but it turned out not to be what I wanted to do. But I said, you know what I'm really good at? I'm really good at teaching 21-year-old boys who want to get into radio how to network, how to make connections that get them good jobs. One of Chris Evans's producers on the Radio 2 breakfast show, which was certainly when I left the biggest breakfast show in the country, was one of my old interns. The guy that was running XFM, I don't know if he still is, but certainly until recently, was one of my old interns. And so somebody said, well, why don't you do that? And I said, well, 21-year-old boys who want to get into radio don't have any money. And they were like, why don't you do it for people who do have money, Marsha? And it honestly never crossed my mind that people would pay for that information. Like this was stuff that I would corner people at parties and force them to listen to. I just talked earlier about how I kind of got tired of it, but before and for the first 2 years of my business, I loved it. Was all I could talk about because I had spent years thinking that networking was walking up to the most important person in the room and going, hi, you look amazing. I'm amazing. Let's be amazing. And I realized that it wasn't. It was just making industry friends. It was just making friends with people that you already like. But there's all these different things that you can do, including, follow up with emails, which actually we talked, Joanna, about having a secret webpage, which I'm guessing you will link to, but it's YesYesMarsha.com/Joanna. And I'll stick some of those email templates on there that I have. Anyway, and so I did it and I made a business out of it. And that just seemed amazing to me. And then, as I said, I managed to kind of I sort of knew that it wouldn't be networking always, but it might morph and change. And then it morphed and changed into storytelling. And now here I am.
So you started off knowing that it was just something you could do in the short term almost.
I mean, yeah, kind of. I mean, the model that I picked was this personality-based coaching. So I'm kind of selling Marsha more than I'm selling anything else in terms of building an audience. And honestly, actually, when I started, I didn't think I was going to do networking. I thought I was going to do career coaching for people who had been really good in one career, but then wanted to change and didn't know what they wanted to do. I don't know why I thought I'd be good at that. I had no idea about what jobs exist because I'd never had a real job myself. I'd been like a freelance radio host and music supervisor for TV shows my whole life. But I sort of decided I wanted to do that, but I knew I needed a niche for my blog. And so I thought I'll write about networking. And then I worked with a coach called Jenny Shee, who said, how would you feel about dropping the career coach thing? And I was like, I would feel great because I have no idea what I'm doing. And so because I'm selling Marsha in terms of my audience, it was easy for me to kind of move over. I sort of did it drip at first, but people were following me more than following exactly the content.
I'm really interested in the decision you made to leave radio. I just wonder if we could go back there for a few minutes, because that's something which I think is very common. So often creative, talented people go into these highly competitive jobs like radio DJ, and you think you've wanted to do it forever. And you do it for quite a few years, and something's not quite right. What do you think was going on there? I mean, does that describe what the situation is?
Yeah, that describes it totally. And I feel like I now have language around it that I didn't at the time. But at the time, I got into radio when I was 19 at university. I got into student radio at Edinburgh University, Fresh Air FM. And I sort of moved up the student radio ladder quite quickly. And I had all these mentors who were all like 50-year-old men from the Midlands. And they all said, once you're bitten by the bug, this is it for life. And I thought, this is me. I'm going to be in radio forever. I didn't think I was going to be a radio DJ forever. I kind of wanted to run my own station eventually, I think. But I really thought that was it. But then I sort of had this thing in radio where I never quite made it to full-time weekdays, which is what you're always aiming for when you're a radio DJ. Like I never quite did. I kept almost, and then like my boss would be fired, or they would bring, some superstar would turn up at the radio station and they would put, him in instead of me or whatever, or they were going to move me to Manchester to work full-time and then they decided to automate instead or whatever, like all these things. So I never quite made it, although I was one of the longest serving. I mean, the good thing about not being full-time is you're less likely to get fired. So I was one of the longest serving DJs at the station, but I still was always like, this is the dream, this is the dream. And then when I moved to full-time, I mean, not when I moved to full-time, I would do cover full-time, for a month. I kind of ended up doing like a month at a time. And this is 15 years into my career, but I started thinking, and the language that I have around it now is from the book, The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks. And he talks about how everything we do falls into one of 4 categories. Zone of incompetence, which is the thing that you do slightly less well than the average population. Zone of competence, which is the thing that you do slightly better than the average population. So my zone of competence would be being techie. Like I'm not very techie, but give me a new social media platform and YouTube and I will figure out how to use it within a few hours. I'll be very slow and very clunky, but I can figure it out. And then there's your zone of excellence and your zone of genius. And your zone of excellence is something that you are substantially better than the average population at, but it's a lot of hard work and really stressful for you. So for me, that was choosing music for TV shows, which I did actually. Oh my gosh, you're British, so you're going to know the TV shows, but I chose the music for The Inbetweeners. And I worked on the first couple of series of Made in Chelsea as well, which, as trashy as you might find the show, they're really good at breaking bands on that show. They're really into having new music. And I definitely had natural talent for that job, but I found it really stressful and not that fun. And most of us tend to work within our zones of competence or zones of excellence because we tend to think that work has to be a grind. And then your zone of genius is the thing where you're like, you guys are going to pay me to do this? Why? It's so easy and fun. And that for me, that's like with networking where I was like, why would anyone pay me money to teach this stuff? That's all I want to do. And I feel like with radio, maybe 5% of the time I was zone of genius where it felt effortless and I was really good. And then the rest I feel like was kind of, whatever the percentage is of 95%, 50% of 95%, I was competence and 50% I was excellence, where I could be really good, but I had to work really hard at it. And sometimes I was just bad. And I felt like I just was feeling that a bit more. Like when I was on full time, I would get bored. I would just run out of things to say. And I just started to suspect that there were things that I was better at. My first ever job in radio was running this team of 40 volunteers at Radio 4th in Edinburgh for the Edinburgh Festival coverage. And I felt like that was something I was really brilliant at. And, as a British person, I didn't used to say that I was really brilliant at things because that's not really what we do. Although now I work with a lot of Americans, so I talk about how great I am all the time. But so I just started to feel like, and so people would come in. Sometimes there would be people who I'd worked with who'd left and got a real job and they'd come in and I'd be like, how is it? And also with radio, you, as a DJ, you're freelance, but you're tied to the city and you're tied to certain hours. So it's like a lot of the disadvantages of having a proper job without sick pay, without holiday pay. Also, it's so insecure. Literally in radio, they'll say to you, oh, that show that you just did, that was your last show. You need to go clear your desk. I found out when I got fired from my first job, and not fired because of bad behavior, just because a new boss came in and they wanted to change the station. I found out I was doing my last show by switching on the radio and hearing the previous DJ announcing that I was doing my last show. And I rang down to the studio and was like, did I get fired? And they were like, oh God, they didn't tell you, did they? And so, that's very insecure. And there's certain things where it's not rocket science as a job and it is really fun, but I just didn't feel like it was my thing anymore. But I don't necessarily recommend just leaving with nothing to go into, especially if you're moving to a new continent and a city where you don't have many friends.
But this idea of zone of genius I find really fascinating because I think we can sense that it's there, can't we? We sense there's something we're not being fulfilled. That sense of boredom, I think, is a really big one. Mm-hmm. But it's really hard, and you've just really talked through the situation. It's really hard to identify what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think once you start to have that framework, you start to see it. So with the storytelling, one of the things that made me think that I wanted to make it my job was that I would be working with storytellers and we would be stuck on, we couldn't figure out the beginning or the ending. And I would say, I'm going to go to the washroom, which is what we call a toilet here in Canada. So I'd say, I'm going to go to the washroom. And by the time I come back, I'll have a beginning or an ending. And I would go and I would like grab a flyer off the side and read it to make my brain think about something else. And by the time I came back, it was like my brain was like, here you go, Marsha. And I thought, I don't know how I do this. And most people can't do this. And so there has to be money in that. Like when you can do something that most people can't do and you don't know how you do, I'm pretty sure there's always money in that. And so long before I figured out where the money was, I had a sense that there was. And I think that was because I had that framework, because I was like, this is easy for me. It's effortless. It's really fun. And people would have their minds blown by it. I'd work with these storytellers and they'd be like, oh my God, like I never looked at my story this way. And it's so amazing. And then they would go on stage and all the audience would be blown away. And even one of the things for me was so there's a big conference in Portland called World Domination Summit, which at the time had 3,000 people. And the first year I went, I told a story on stage to 3,000 people and it was amazing. When 3,000 people laugh at your joke, you have, and I know this from interviewing stand-up comedians, you have to wait for the joke to roll around the room and come back to you, for the laugh to roll around the room and come back to you. And it was really fun. But the following year, they got me to start coaching the storytellers. And I was so struck sitting in the front of that audience as the storytellers were telling the stories that we worked on. I remember thinking, I like this better. I like this more than I did when it was me. And I'm like a ham. Like I host my own show. I loved it. I make silly videos with lots of wigs. Like I love being on center stage, but I love coaching more than I love telling stories. And I'm better at it as well. I'm a pretty good storyteller, but I'm a much better storytelling coach.
And this is your zone of genius now that you've found for forever? Who knows? Do you think?
Yeah, who knows? I mean, it's funny, like one of the services I do is I help people write sales pages, which is hilarious because I was in radio and music supervision. Everybody sold to me for my entire career. I got taken out for dinner and taken to fancy restaurants and taken on trips. I had one sales job where I cried every day for 2 weeks and then I quit. And then when I started my own business, I had to sell again and I was terrified and I was horrible at it. And then I worked for a year with this lady called Kendrick Shope. I'll put a link to her website on the secret webpage. And she basically rewired my brain and taught me how to sell. And now one of the things that I do is I use some of my storytelling visualizations and things to help. Some of the things that I use to teach people how to be good storytellers, I teach them how to write sales pages. So that's not a thing that I mean, I would have laughed at you if you told me 6 years ago that people would pay me vast amounts of money to teach them how to write a sales page. So I feel like it's always going to ebb and flow, but certainly something around storytelling, it feels like it's like has this powerful pull to me, and that there are so many different sort of versions and iterations of it. Whereas with the networking, it felt kind of pretty niche. So we'll see. But I also never say never. Like my plan was absolutely to move back to Edinburgh. I was working at XFM and I was planning to move back to Edinburgh, but I said, you never know what life's going to throw at you. Maybe I'll fall in love with a Norwegian and move to Norway. And instead I fell in love with a Torontonian and moved to Toronto. So I'm open to whatever might be down the line.
That's a fantastic link into the work you do and the sharing of stories, because a lot of creatives, this, we know that we should be sharing stories. We know that stories are a good thing. We're told, well, we should be talking about our work and what we do, but it's really hard.
Mm-hmm. But here's the thing. It's not that hard. And people think it is. They think one of the great myths of storytelling is that you're born with it or you're not. And that is absolutely not true. It is a learned skill with a set of rules that anyone can do. And we all know this because we all have that one person in our life that could tell any story and it's fascinating. And we all have been stuck next to that one person who we know did something interesting, but dear God, when will it end? And that's because the first person is following those rules and the second person isn't. For my storytelling show, I've been running it 5.5 years. We have a 2-year waiting list. I have never turned away a single storyteller, not one, because everybody can tell compelling stories if they follow the rules.
So let's think about individual creatives. A lot of people I work with are individual creatives. And it's so often the case. So I get a writer or a photographer and wonderful, wonderful creative people coming in and say, and we talk about the story behind their work. And I'm sure this is something you see all the time. And there's this sense of, yes, but my story is the same as anybody else's. Yes, but I want my work to speak for itself. There's a lot of fear, isn't there, about feeling you're not interesting enough. And I think often creative work, there's a sense you've been rejected so many times that you don't want to put your story out there.
But here's the thing is I think people think people think wrongly about their story. So I just started recording a podcast, and the first one was all about like if everybody's told you like you want to tell your story, because people often come on consult calls with me and they say I want to tell my story, and I always say why. And often people are like, because I have to tell my story. Like people don't really think about it. But if you think about why you want to tell your story, the reason I ask that question is because every story is edited. Like every story is edited. Otherwise, all of your stories would say, I walked into the room and there was a brown desk and a white fan and the floor was kind of grey and there was a bin that was green, and like that would be a banana story that would go on for 40 years and everyone would be bored. You have to edit. And so when you're telling your story, it's not first I was born and then I cried and then I had some, whatever, breast milk, and then I cried again and then I went to sleep. Like, again, that's going to be a boring story. And so think about, why do you want to tell your story? And if it's to get more clients, then think about, okay, who are your clients and what do they need to know about you in order to connect with you? Or if it's to like to get people to buy this particular service from me, then it's like, okay, well, what do they need to know from your story in order to get that service? And actually, one of the other big myths about storytelling is that it's about narrative. It's about what happened. It's absolutely not. It's about how you tell the story. If I tell you, I went to the Arctic and I was there for 3 months and it was so interesting. And I met these 2 different scientists who were such cool guys. And then we went to these really 3 great parties and I saw 4 different kinds of wildlife. I had an amazing time. You would be like, awesome. Thank you for wasting the last 30 seconds of my life. But if I said, I stepped outside the house this morning and I had this excitement in the pit of my stomach. And when I put my hands in my pocket, I felt the money. It was there. This was going to happen. And that's about me going to the corner shop to buy a bag of crisps. But it's just about creating those action scenes. And so storytelling really is just a stringing together of action scenes. And so if you're telling your story, you only really need one action scene. And that either could be the action scene where everything changed. But what's much more interesting is the action scene that your potential client can relate to, because they'll be like, oh my gosh, I've been through that experience. You get me. You know who I am. Or it could be like a story of someone that you worked with. Or it could be just like a quirky way of talking about, why you do what you do. Like when people ask me what my story is, because I did the same thing where I was like, oh, it's not very interesting to be like, oh, well, I did networking for a while and then I started a storytelling show and then I wasn't sure what to do. It's like, kill me. That's too. So what I say is I was the person who always told really long-winded stories. And my friends would be like, oh my gosh, please, can you get to the point? Because then they're being like, I walked into the grass. It was a light green and a mid green and a dark green. And then I worked in music radio for 15 years. And suddenly I had to cut my stories from 20 minutes down to 20 seconds, because after 20 seconds, the jingle kicks in and you have to stop talking because someone else is. And so that was where I learned how to edit my stories and how to get the most bang for my buck in those 20 seconds. And that's all I say. Like, that's not the whole story of my whole business. I've missed out loads of stuff, but it's compelling because being a radio DJ is sexy. It's compelling because so many of my potential clients aren't able to cut their stories down. Their stories are much too long. And so it shows you that I can do that. It gives me credibility because it shows that if I can get a story down to 20 seconds, then getting one down to 5 minutes would be pretty easy. Being a radio DJ is kind of sexy and interesting. You have that little visual of the lower, like audio, whatever an auditory visual is, an aural of the jingle kicking in after 20 seconds. So you're just picking something. I feel like stories are spin, and they have been since time immemorial, that you just pick the bit of the story that sounds good, and that's the bit that's entertaining. People often think that a story is like, tell me absolutely everything, and if you don't, then I'll think you're a liar. But if you did that, the story would be, I walked in and the window frame was blue, and underneath it there was a small spider, and the spider was 30 centimeters, not 30 centimeters.
Well, I would hope not.
3 millimeters across.
And the other thing that's really striking me is it comes back to what you were saying in your own story, is about that this is learned, that we don't need to apologize for the fact that our own stories need work, that we're not born with a good story that's edited, but actually this is a craft and a skill that we can and have to master.
Absolutely. A friend of mine, so I had a consult call recently with someone who had been in a group with a friend of mine, Erin Rogers. She's one of my best friends, so I can throw her under the bus. And he was like, I just want to be able to tell good stories whenever I am. Because I'd said, you need to practice. It's a learned skill. You need to learn the rules. And he said, but I don't want to have to practice. I just want to be able to tell good stories wherever I am. And he said, Erin Rogers, she starts telling a story and all of us are wrapped immediately. And I said, Erin Rogers is like me. At a very young age, she and I both figured out separately that when we tell a good story, everybody everybody listens and we feel inherently lovable. So we started practicing. I walk around all day, every day, practicing stories in my head. The way that my thoughts are arranged is mostly through conversations with people. And whenever something happens to me, I immediately start thinking about how I would tell it as a story. And so people who are good storytellers have just been putting in those Malcolm Gladwell style 10,000 hours of practicing, but they're not necessarily conscious that they've been doing it. And so you just have to do it. And I've seen horrible storytellers tell brilliant stories once they have learned those rules and put them into practice.
It's not something, is it, that's innate? So as you say, we can be a horrible storyteller, but actually we just need to be able to refine or edit a story for our website or for that client conversation.
Yeah. And again, think about why, like always you should do this before you write any blog page, any press release, like before you do literally anything in your business ever. Ask yourself, why am I doing this? And what do I want to be different in the world as a result? But it's the same with the stories. Why do you want to tell that story? What do you want to be different in the world as a result?
And presumably, what do you want the person listening to be doing or thinking or reacting as a result?
Yeah, exactly.
So, yes, if you're walking into, I don't know, an ad agency, well, why are we booking you? Actually, the story will be the thing that distinguishes you from the other ad agency, but it's a story that you want them to go, oh, that person's really got credibility.
But also that particular ad agency, because maybe you walk into one where like they have really strong activism streak. And so you're not going to go into that one and be like, well, when I worked for McDonald's and Coca-Cola, they paid me loads of money and then I had a bath in it and then burnt it. Like you're going to maybe pick the stories where you say, well, when I went to go and volunteer at this, very worthy charity or whatever, or vice versa. If you're walking to somewhere where you know that they, respect celebrities very highly, then you're going to talk about the times that you worked with all these super famous people or whatever. You're always going to edit the stories depending on who you're talking to. And same when you're putting things on your website, like think about who's reading it and what you want them to do or think differently as a result of writing the story. And then that's how you're going to edit and pick your stories.
There are two big myths we're busting here, aren't there? One is that it's just automatic, and two, that it's about your story, when actually it's about the connection between you and your listener. There's no point in telling a story to a wall. All creative things need that audience, don't they? Need the other side of the story.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think about who that audience is. Like, I don't think that you need to do that in pure art. I think that you should just, follow your muse or whatever. But if you're doing something because you want people to do something differently as a result, then think about it. And I think the other thing with storytelling is, I mentioned earlier that it's not about narrative. Really what it's about is action scenes. It's about moments. And you found this, when you asked that question about the creative challenge or block, the really exciting ones are the ones where people really get into the action of what was happening, what were those moments. And so think, sometimes you can tell a story that's really just a scene. You don't have to go into beginning, middle, and end and what's the arc. I often work with people or speak to people and they say, oh, do you teach hero's journey and do you teach these different story archetypes? And I'm like, that's cool. I super respect people who can do that. I don't move through my life and see those archetypes. I just move through my life and have a strong emotional reaction. And then I'm like, okay, that's probably a story.
We respond very much to emotional reactions, don't we? So if somebody tells you, I was really sad, I was really happy, I was really tearful, that's what moves us.
That's the biggest mistake people make in storytelling, is they don't put the emotion in, because the emotion is how we connect with any story. We haven't had every experience, but we've had almost every emotion. So somebody could be telling a story about going and protesting at Standing Rock. One of the storytellers at my show did, and it was really powerful. Everybody in the audience was really affected by it. I'm pretty sure no one else in that audience had been to protest at Standing Rock. I'm pretty sure most of us hadn't been to the kind of protest where you might get arrested or maced. But all of us know exactly how it feels to be somewhere where you're supposed to be brave and to feel terrified. All of us know exactly how it feels to be somewhere where you're supposed to be brave, to do something cowardly and then to feel shame. And that was how we connected to the story. If you say, I drove my car into my neighbor's house, if we don't know how you feel, we don't know how to feel about that. Maybe you drove your car into your neighbor's house and your neighbor is terrifying and now you're frightened for your life. Maybe you drove your car into your neighbor's house and you have a huge crush on your neighbor and you're thrilled that finally you get the chance to interact with her.
I love that idea.
But the emotion is what helps us to connect with it. And also the other thing about emotions is they build tension. If I say I'm sat outside my sister's house in my car, then you'll be like, cool. But if I said I'm sat outside my sister's house in my car and I'm terrified, straight away you're like, ooh, why are you terrified? Or I'm so excited. Why are you so excited? As humans, we hate an information gap. And having that emotion keeps us listening because we want to know what's going to happen. And it builds tension. And when there is tension in a story, then a bunch of different things happen. One is it holds your attention, and something called transference happens, which is the thing where you feel like what's happening in the story happens to you. But also it starts flooding your brain with dopamine, reward, and oxytocin, bonding and trust. And especially if you're a creative who's telling stories on their website, you're probably trying to sell, at the very least, your ideas. And trust is very helpful when you're trying to sell anything.
One slightly provocative question related to that is that I was talking to a friend this week about this old idea about men not sharing their emotions. Is that something you particularly have to work on with men to encourage them to say, put the emotion in?
I find it's not so much men, but like Brits and North Americans. I feel like we're super taught not to talk about our emotions other than, if we're like sharing what happened with our best friends as we're kind of discussing things. But I think generally when we're telling stories, we're sort of taught that emotion is embarrassment. And again, that's a learned skill. Like that's a thing that you can pick up. I suggest to people that they pick something that they do several times a day, like go to the toilet or get a glass of water. And every time you remember to do it, which maybe is 1 in 10, then you ask yourself, how do I feel? And where do I feel that in my body? Because that's one of the ways to describe your emotions. And you probably won't feel much of anything. You're probably like, I'm a little bit anxious or I'm a tiny bit happy. I have this wonderful client called Linda Ugalo, who is a dancer, and she's very expressive. And when I gave her that instruction, she came back the next week and she said, Marsha, you told me to tell you my emotion. And it's always the same. It's always joy because I love urinating. Which I can get behind. But so you can hone that skill. You can learn to start recognizing what your emotions are so that then you can express them. And actually, there are 3 different ways to talk about your emotions, which I'll stick a link to this on the secret webpage, but I have like a whole video and a PDF. The video, a lot of wigs, a lot. I dress up as a 70s star, and I also insert myself into a very famous 80s music video. But I talk about the different ways that you can express emotions in storytelling and how that's the magic bullet to any good story.
And Marsha's videos are well worth watching.
Thank you.
So I'm going to put all those links up at creativelifeshow.com, where you can connect to the secret webpage with a lot of other resources. And we've talked about quite a lot of other people and books, which I will put those up as well at creativelifeshow.com. Marsha, apart from the secret webpage, where can people connect with you?
I'm just YesYesMarsha everywhere. So my website is YesYesMarsha.com. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, just /YesYesMarsha. And I also would love to mention my new Facebook group, which is sort of growing by the day, which is called I Don't Have My Ish Together Either, which is basically a space. We do a weekly thread on Tuesday, although people can post anytime, where it's kind of counterbalance Facebook, where everyone's like, my life is perfect in every way. And it makes us feel inadequate. So you have to post one thing that makes you feel like you don't really have your ish together. And then it makes all of us feel better about ourselves as humans.
And very good practice for telling those stories. And
yes, exactly.
It does not have to be perfect. We should presumably where it's coming from.
Totally. Exactly that. It's because after 5 years of working with storytellers, I've realized that pretty much all of us walk around all day, every day, thinking that everybody else has their ish together and we're the only ones that don't. Everybody else has a perfect relationship or a perfect business or a perfect family. And, I'm the only one that doesn't. And then we go on Facebook and everybody's like, oh, look at me and my partner. Look at me and my kids. I don't have kids. So when I go on holiday, it's actually relaxing. And it makes us feel worse. And actually, everybody feels like this. This is what I've learned. Every single person feels like everybody else is nailing it and they're the only ones that aren't. And so this is a way to just kind of show them, actually, it's okay. Nobody else has their ish together either.
Fantastic. Go and join Marsha's Get Your Ish Together Facebook group and share all the rubbish bits that you don't put on Facebook.
Exactly.
Marsha, thank you so much for coming on. That's been a huge pleasure.
This has been so much fun.
So if things have resonated with you, then come over and share what you've learned on the Creative Life Show or in the Creative Life Facebook group. We'd love to know what your emotions are about that you could share. The stories that perhaps you can put out this week. It is a learned skill and it's something that we can all get better at it. So thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen and have a wonderfully creative week.